Hello viewers. The people in the East are remarkably passionate about their religion. However, at times this religious passion translates into bigotry, intolerance, and persecution of other religions and creeds. That is the reason the East is criticized from time to time by the West for religious intolerance. However, the West itself has a long history of religious intolerance and persecution. In fact, there have been more religion inspired deaths in the West than in the East. You are watching Wisdom of Life. We start with the religious persecution in ancient Greece. The ancient Greece had a polytheistic religion without a book, church, creed, or a professional priestly class. The existence of a number of cults meant toleration for other cults. The ancient Greeks perceived all aspects of individual and social life subject to supernatural influence. Therefore, paying proper respect to the gods and legendary heroes was deemed necessary. Respect was paid through sacrifices, rituals, hymns, and making statues, altars, and temples. And here, the limits to the religious freedom became quite visible. According to Oswald Spengler, the poets and philosophers were free to spin myths about the gods and interpret the cults the way they wanted, but no one was permitted to touch the statue or the cult. A number of philosophers were persecuted for questioning the integrity of the cult. The foremost example is that of the philosopher Socrates, who was put to death on the charge of religious impiety, specifically because of believing in one God and suspected of mutilating the statues of the god Hermes. In his defense during his trial, Socrates stated that the offering gifts to the gods isn't necessary for being religious, and thus he repudiated a very fundamental practice of the Greeks. Likewise, the poet Diagoras was executed for chopping the wooden statue of the god Heracles. Many philosophers saved themselves by fleeing. These included Aristotle, Pythagoras, and Anaxagoras. Therefore, we can say that religious tolerance in ancient Greece was no more than a myth. From ancient times, we pass on to religious intolerance in medieval and modern Europe. Medieval Europe, in the long history that is for the 1000 years, is known as the Age of Faith because religion, specifically Christianity, exercised complete control over the hearts and minds of the people. In early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity and thus embarked on Christianization of the vast Roman Empire. In 380, Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, and thus from a persecuted religion, Christianity became a persecutor. Rival creeds were ruthlessly suppressed and in many cases were forced to totally disappear. These included Manichaeism and Mithraism, both being of Iranian origin. The institution of Inquisition served as the chief instrument of religious persecution. Inquisition was set up by popes to combat heresy. Any interpretation of faith that differed from the official one, that is, one given by the church, was deemed heretical. The punishments for heresy ranged from excommunication to imprisonment and torture, and finally to burning alive. The 16th century saw advent of Reformation and thus asceticism in Christianity. Both the Catholic Church and the new Protestant Church began to denounce each other as heretical publicly. This practice continued until the beginning of the 20th century and also gave rise to what are known as the European Wars of Religions. These were a series of wars between 16th and 18th centuries, and they caused widespread destruction and deaths. Number of deaths vary from 7 million to 17 million. Another important practice was that of the witch hunt. Historically, witches have been linked to black magic. However, in medieval Europe and early modern times, witchcraft assumed unique meaning. It was interpreted as repudiation of Christ and Christianity, devil worship, and association with demons. Witches were accused of child kidnapping, killing, and eating. Devil was regarded as the worst enemy of the Christian faith. Witches, being Satan's followers, were regarded as enemy of Christian church and society. In 1374, Pope Gregory XI issued an edict whereby all magic done with the aid of demons was considered open to persecution for heresy. Although witches included both men and women, 3/4 of the convicted witches were women. Notable victims of Inquisition included Joan of Arc, philosopher Bruno, and scientist Galileo. Joan of Arc was a peasant girl who, believing that she was acting under divine guidance, successfully led the French army against England. A year afterward, she was captured and burned to death on the charge of heresy. Bernard Shaw's play Saint John is a very vivid expression and manifestation of the tragedy of Saint John. Bruno was an Italian philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician who, before Copernicus, declared that Earth was not in the center of the universe. And because this was regarded as heretical, he was burnt alive on the orders of the Pope. His contemporary Galileo, who had similar views, avoided death by publicly recanting his views. And the Bosnian War is too recent to be forgotten. The three main parties in the war were Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. Bosnian Muslims were the primary victims, and the Serbs were the main perpetrators. And an important part of that war, a heart-rending part, was the Srebrenica massacre, in which over 7,000 Bosnian Muslims were massacred by Serbs. So if next time any Western criticize an Eastern for religious intolerance, if you are an Eastern, you can also point it out to him that the West also has a long history of religious persecution and intolerance. Thanks for watching.